definitely loving our learning and continuing in that. So when I was thinking of whether to provide a blessing or a prayer, it occurred to me that since we are having the most important election, I believe, in our lifetimes, and we must continue to remember how important our country is to us. And to me, as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, it is the most important country, as it was to my parents. So I would like to ask all of you to join me, either muted or unmuted. I know that the cacophony of many of our voices will not be dissonance, but will be a love. But I see Nancy is shaking her head that, so if you could join me as muted in the prayer that you see us for our country. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. Amen.
Amen.
And may I just ask you, if you have not done so, to please either vote beforehand or on November 3rd. Please, 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 please find wherever your voting precinct is, and please vote. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Fancy. A reminder, can everyone please turn off their videos? Thank you. Now, except for our speakers, who I've lost on my screen. Thank you, Francie. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker and interviewer, Paul Goldberg and Susan Coll. Paul Goldberg is an author and a science journalist. He's the editor and publisher of Cancer Letter, a weekly publication focused on cancer research. Paul is also the author of The Yid, a comedy presenting an alternative history of Stalin's death, and The Chateau, a comedy about Trump supporting former Soviet Jews living in a Florida condominium building ruled by a kleptocratic board. He recently completed The Dissident, a novel about Soviet Jews and American reporters set in Moscow in 1976. Along with the fiction writings, his nonfiction books include How We Do Harm, A Doctor Breaks Ranks About Being Sick in America with Dr. Otis Brawley, and The Thaw Generation, Coming of Age in the Post-Stalin Era with Ludmila Alexieva. Now you can understand the title of today's presentation, Fiction and Nonfiction, as written by Paul Goldberg, author of both. In a change of format, Paul will be interviewed by his wife, Susan. Susan is also an accomplished author, writing the novels The Stager, Beach Week, Acceptance, Rockville Pike, and KarlMarx.com. Susan's work has appeared in the Washington Post, Washingtonian, Moment Magazine, NPR.org, Atlantic.org, and the Millions. And Susan is the president of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Paul and Susan are both longtime members of Temple Micah. Thank you, Paul and Susan. The session is now yours.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. Yeah, as you say, it's a rather broad mandate
fiction and nonfiction as written by Paul Goldberg. And as vague as that might sound, it's pretty relevant because this is an intersection that Paul navigates pretty much every day. So I thought we have a lot of ground to cover, but I thought we would begin by talking about how you actually navigate that. Your day job is sort of very precise in what you do, covering science, covering the politics and money of oncology. And yet your fiction is, he's just got this wild, crazy, creative mind. And I teach a class on novel writing, and I always bring Paul in as my first guest speaker to talk about voice, because he's really the voiciest writer I've ever known or read. So I thought we'd just talk at first very generally about voice and, you know, how you do this. Do you just sit down and write? Does this just come to you, or do you give it a lot of thought?
It's kind of thank you again for agreeing to do this. Susan will try to keep me focused, which is sort of like flying a kite. But it's sort of like the question is sort of like a question of what language do you speak in, if you speak more than, or think in rather, if you speak more than one language. And the answer is, heck if I know. It's, you think in concepts, you are where you need to be. And I guess the boundary between fiction and nonfiction and reality and fantasy is really not quite as clear as one would want it to be. For example, you know, science certainly is a very creative process. It's not done by automatons. News judgment is very much of a creative process. Putting something together, like what we do every week at the Cancer Letter, is a crazy creative process. You hear a lot of noise from the office, but fiction is kind of special in many ways because it's kind of different on kind of almost the DNA level. You know, it's like every step you take is going to be different when you're writing fiction than when you're writing nonfiction. Whereas, at least when I am, it's kind of a little bit freer. And yet there are also limitations, like especially with historical fiction, how much liberty can you take with what actually occurred?
Yeah, and also in your work, it's not entirely, but it's largely historical fiction or historically based. So why don't you talk a little bit about the Yid? I guess the elevator pitch for the Yid would be that it's a comedy about Stalin's death, which is a good place to start. But it's also got a lot of it came from urban legends that were circulating in Moscow.
Some of it is urban legends, some of it is kind of a disputed historical theory of history of what may or may not have been occurring at that time. But the center of it all is Stalin, who being an old man, you know, dictators don't really get to die in a very peaceful and calm way. It's just not how it's written. Was starting to get paranoid and anti-Semitic, and was supposedly, it's certainly not been proven beyond shadow of a doubt, was but urban legends were many. Was getting paranoid about, you know, was preparing to deport the Jews. The part that's very clear is that he did imprison his doctors. So the Kremlin hospital was basically imprisoned. So how many old men who get paranoid hate their doctors and want to imprison them? That actually could be a very interesting fantasy, and many would love to do that, I suspect. So what to me, my entry point into the story was just walking around Moscow as a kid and people telling me, like my grandfather, for example, look over there, you know, this is where the trains were coming in, this is where the train stood. And I knew it was, and there were lists, and the lists are often discussed, lists of Jews living in particular apartment area, apartment buildings. So basically people who were paying rent they were, the apartment buildings had the lists essentially. So you can look at, who was a Jew in of the people paying the rent. So putting together a list was actually a very straightforward thing and could be produced very quickly. So special lists may not have existed. So it's entirely believable. All of Moscow believed that that would be the next thing because Stalin did do quite well at deporting populations. Like the Germans were deported from the Volga, ethnic Germans to Kazakhstan and so forth. The Crimean Tatars were also deported. The Chechens were deported. So deportations were very, very common. So the Jews were going to get the next, then be the next ones to do it. It's a little bit more difficult to deport Jews from urban areas because there are so many and they're dispersed. And then what do you do with the half Jews? What do you do with the quarter Jews? At what point? Fascism was a very difficult thing to put into action.
And tell everyone what happened at the bookstore in Brooklyn. Was somebody asked a question about this very subject, or didn't ask a question, raised his hand and addressed it.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. It was a Chabad sitting in the back of a very secular bookstore in Brooklyn. And he's just sort of starts talking about his own experience. His family moved to Leningrad in 1953, probably like winter of 53. January, give or take. And his mother called a plumber. And the plumber comes in and she says, well, this faucet doesn't work. The toilet doesn't flush. God knows. Just whole list of things that were wrong. And the plumber kept saying, nah, we don't need to fix that. You won't need it. No, you won't need that. No, you won't need that. You won't need that. You won't need it. So basically what he was trying to say is that you will be deported before this becomes a real problem. And it's true because really he was working for the office, it's called the Residential Exploitation Office, or REC is the acronym, where they would have had the lists or could have produced the lists rather quickly. But it was just gives you an idea of how it was expected. I certainly grew up with the knowledge that this was happening.
There's also in the Yid a lot of Shakespeare, and one sort of Shakespearean thread at the end with Stalin holed up, kind of going mad. Not to spend too much time on this parallel, but it does seem like there are parallels right now to what is happening in the White House.
Yeah, so you have a shut-in ruler going mad. The country is going mad with him in a very Shakespearean manner. I've always really thought of Stalin as a Shakespearean character. I'm probably not the only one. I'm definitely not, because there's a huge tradition of Shakespeare in Soviet Yiddish theater, which was also destroyed, by the way, in a very Shakespearean way, including murder. Yeah, it's also this obsession with quacks, right? Stalin did have that obsession with witch doctors, essentially. There was a belief in using baking soda baths, foot baths that were going to keep you healthy, and of course putting doctors in prisons. So yeah, tyrants hate science. And that's where things really kind of line up for me pretty well. My day job and my interest in writing and history. But Stalin was certainly into quacks. Hitler was very much into quacks. Although I would have to say, from the cancer control perspective, Hitler was pretty good. He understood smoking pretty well and ran pretty good campaigns against smoking. And so, well, he was very selective in how he applied his knowledge, but he was into quackery. and Stalin was into quackery, and now I think we're hearing about herd immunity being a good thing, which will slaughter 1.2 million Americans if implemented, and it could be more depending on how quickly this disease spreads.
Well, still on the topic of Trump, let's try and steer that back to comedy. Your last novel, The Chateau, while not a historical novel, it's very political in amidst the comedy. You want to talk a little bit about that and where Trump fits into that book?
Oh gosh, well, it all kind of it all happened because I had just finished finished the Yid, and the Yid did get a lot of reviews, a lot of notice, and it was really just a very enjoyable thing to have written. And then Trump started kind of showing up in the polls and on the Republican side, and I was thinking, this is fascinating because I had just returned from Florida, where my father lives, and I was there with a bunch of his friends. And I was sitting in the middle of a dinner party where the conversation turned incredibly racist. And I said, oh, if it were my house, I'd throw these people out, but it's not my house. I can't. So I started getting more and more into it, and plus, of course, at the time, there were some issues involving a kleptocratic board at my father's condominium, and I started thinking, well, maybe I should just put it all together. Actually, I didn't really think about it. I was telling Susan about this whole thing, and Susan said, maybe you should think about that as your next novel, and I kind of took it to the next step, because as Trump was kind of rising through the primaries, I was thinking, well, and actually when it became clear that he was going to be elected, when he was elected, I said, I think it's really something I need to be writing right now. And I wrote it rather fast because Americans haven't seen their history through fiction, their current events through fiction. We Russians, or people of Russian culture, certainly have. And I was thinking that this is such a singular event, such a fascinating event, that I should show it what is going on through the eyes of fictional characters and experience it through them. And so I have this fictional condominium filled with fictional Trump supporting Russian Jews, which to me is a fascinating concept, and yet it's definitely there. I mean, if you look at, places like Sunny Isles, which is probably about 80-90% Russian, it's going to vote like Alabama. So it was really a fascinating idea. Oh, and the other thing about Trump is that we Russians can't really pronounce his name. It's Trump. And so what I did was I made up a kind of a story with I replayed Turgenev's Fathers and Sons in Florida among Soviet Jews who love Trump, and then change is coming. And so the whole book is really taking place between New Year's, essentially, or actually the shooting in Fort Lauderdale Airport, and Trump's inauguration. And it's the son is a nebbishy, just fired reporter from the Washington Post, a science writer. And the father is, unlike my father, kind of more like the characters, the two bozos, the two clowns who were helping Giuliani with his heroin deal involving Ukraine. So that's kind of like that's the characters, and it's pretty horrifying, really. But it's also, I think it was really wrong, because Americans really do want to understand what's going on, and Trump books have done very well. And this, I don't think America is quite ready, thank God, to experience current events through fiction.
Yeah, it's a really smart book, and it got a great write-up in the New York Review of Books comparing him to Bernard Malamud and I forget who else. So
Good.
it really is a very good book, but I think it landed right at a moment when people couldn't quite believe what had happened, and it didn't seem very funny. So maybe it will have a long shelf life. So your new book that you've just finished, he's just like putting the finishing touches on, is called The Dissident. And that's probably of huge interest to this group today because it's kind of an inside out view of what was happening in Russia at the time that we American Jews were involved in the Soviet Jewry movement. So can you talk about that book a little?
This was really, here material is really important. So I understand, the way I kind of come into this story is really through three perspectives, at least, really more than that probably. But the first of them is that of a kid in Moscow. I left in 1973 at age 14. So, one day I'm walking down a heap of street to see what's actually going on, and I run into a demonstration on Simchat Torah, and I had no idea what Simchat Torah is, for example. My parents, and then there's also, this would have been around 1970s. So right around that time, there's the Leningrad airplane hijacking attempt, which has really looked very different from Moscow than it does from here, because I really was actually quite horrified by it, and I still am really. So I understood that there. And then, of course, Moscow, the novel really turned into a love letter to Moscow, and you really have to love Moscow and understand Moscow. And, but I was there, I was experiencing it, so I kind of feel the city. Then we came here in 1973, and we were very involved and my parents were through Irene Menikovsky, actually through involved in the Soviet Jewry movement as it was growing there. So the American Soviet Jewry movement was very contentious. The questions were being raised about what is the Israel position, what is the American position, what is the activist position, and the activist groups were fighting with the B'nai B'rith groups, and it was pretty brutal. So I kind of saw that, experienced that, and I was helping translate. In fact, recently there was an exhibit where I saw a whole bunch of, our picture of coming off a plane was in the recent exhibit that was put together by the Jewish Historical Society. But I also looked at a bunch of documents fairly recently, and I said, oh my God, this looks like it was written by a 14-year-old with an Olivetti typewriter. And guess what? I was that 14-year-old with an Olivetti typewriter doing this horrific translating job. It was the best I could do. So basically, and then many years later after college, I was working, I decided to actually write a couple of historical books, and I did I did a nonfiction book. My first book was called The Final Act. It came out in 1988, and to do that, it was about the Moscow-Helsinki Watch Group, which is a dissident group. And through that, I started getting a whole lot of documents. All of that is in there. The book's fairly obscure, but it was published by a major publisher, but it went straight into obscurity. But what it did leave me with is hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews with direct participants of the movement. And also, diaries of one particular individual. So what I ended up with is kind of we thought that this might really want to be a novel, because to unpack it, you cannot unpack it in any other way. Here you are in Moscow. Here are these Americans, here's Mayor Kahana. Here are the Greek, you know, here are the American reporters in Moscow. Here's Israel. Here are these battles that are very arcane being fought about what is Israel's position in all of this. And Israel really did not want Soviet Jews to be working through the human rights groups. So things got, and but really once you kind of landed in the city and show how it's really playing out in the streets of Moscow, that's really what I was doing. And that's really also was the final act. And now it's this novel called The Dissident. And it begins with a Jewish wedding in Moscow on Hanukkah, on the first night of Hanukkah in 1975, and ends with Kissinger's visit in January 1976.
And threaded through the novel, it's sort of an homage to Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. Can you talk about that a little?
As I started going through the writing, I realized that I couldn't really do it without looking back at The Master and Margarita, which is always been really one of my favorite books. But it suddenly occurred to me that I'm sure other people would agree with, many other people would agree with this point, is that the entire Jewish immigration movement, or the Jewish rebirth of Jewish identity, and as well as the Russian Orthodoxy and the spiritual movement, comes out of this book by this, which is basically largely, it's many things, but one of the things it is a Faust rooted in Moscow around 1930. It's like no book I've ever read. I remember when it came out, which was November 1965 in the journal Moskva, which is sort of a noise-getrennte journal. It was like a missile hit. I was 6 years old, but I knew that a missile hit. Then, you know, it's
what do you mean a missile hit?
Everybody talked about it. It was the culture of the city was completely changed through this. It was more important than anything that occurred. And what it is really three novels. One of them is The Devil Comes to Moscow, and it's a comedy, that part of it. And the, you know, people with characters, not people, beings surrounding the devil. It's very nonfiction based, by the way. It's everything is, if you go through Bulgakov's part of Moscow, which is my part of Moscow, you just see it all. I mean, the streets are named, the characters are named. It's all believable. It's all true. I mean, there's even the most fantastical scene in the novel, which is the Satan's Ball, is based on the American ambassador's ball that he held in 1930 or so. I don't remember precisely what year, in the Spaso house nearby, which is the ambassador's residence. So it's one of the characters in the novel is a Bulgakovist, and I have this very funny scene. I think it's, well, I don't know if it's funny. It's actually, the book's not humor. Oh yeah, let me get back to Bulgakov. I'm sorry. There are three books here. One of them is in three novels interwoven. One of them is The Devil Comes to Moscow in 1930 or so. The second one is a love story between a writer and this unhappily married woman who abandons her husband for insecurity for him. And then the third part, which is the part I like the least, and I'm not sure I really still like it that much. I've skipped it every time I've reread the book, largely, and that's Bulgakov's novel about Pontius Pilate and kind of a story of Jesus. And he makes it more current to his own life. And that's the part I spent the most time as I was writing this, the Dissident, is that part that gave me the most trouble. I ended up talking to priests. I ended up reading it over and over and over. I ended up reading a whole lot of literature written by believers and non-believers, Christians and non-Christians, and finally I kind of understood it a little bit more. And that's really and then so in my novel there's this one of the scenes is a lecture by one of the characters at an event called the Seminar on Jewish Culture.
Can we just interrupt for 1 second? And can you
Thank
repeat
you.
repeat the title and of the book is The Master and Margarita that he's talking about by Bulgakov. What's Bulgakov's first name? Mikhail. I think not, Americans aren't as familiar with him as they should be. I have to confess I was not, and I even worked at a bookstore at the time, and I was not. So he was not published in his lifetime, or this book was not.
The book was,
Yeah, talk about that just for a minute. It's pretty central to your book, so it's not veering off too far.
Well, it's not at all. I mean, really, his Moscow is my Moscow. He was born, he died in 1940. The book wouldn't come out for 25 years. It was hidden. He is, when it did come out, he used some codes and about, what the addresses were, but people did figure out where he lived. I guess I'm not really answering the question.
And his wife had put the manuscript away.
She hid
right?
the manuscript, and there are versions of the manuscript. Some people say that it's not really a finished novel because she finished it, and there's a lot of discussion about the meaning of that book because there's just so much there. By the way, he was also a morphine addict, and since he was dying of a kidney condition, some people have actually looked at the pages of the manuscript and saw that it's a lot of morphine there. And you can see it, and you can also see it in the writing. So there's a lot to decipher, and that, by the way, in 1975, 76, I'm not really sure the term Bulgakovist existed. The term Pushkinist certainly existed, but now it certainly exists. If anybody finds themselves in Moscow next, go to the Bulgakov Museum. It's a hoot. I did enjoy teaching a class on The Master and Margarita, Politics and Prose, about 1.5 years ago. I probably should do it again.
Yeah, it was a very popular class.
It's fun.
So I could keep asking Paul questions all day, and I probably will, although about other things like dinner.
Yes.
But I've been told, I think right about now is when we might want to turn it over, and we have a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure what the format is. I'm happy to just ask those.
We usually let Sid do those.
Okay.
So you can relax.
Okay.
And Sid, if you want to unmute yourself, and
I will do that. And I'm grateful for this duet here. I see you're shifting the camera now to Paul.
Yeah. On him now.
We have several questions here, but at some point, Paul, I would like to shift the focus to your work on the cancer letter. And how that has affected, maybe we could start there. How has that experience dealing with various administrations and serving as an investigative reporter, what has that experience like, and has it affected your writing as a novelist?
Well, I don't know. As a novelist, I'm not sure. As a nonfiction writer, certainly, because I've co-written a book about medicine and why the American medical system is as screwed up as it is. So the cancer letter is kind of central to what I do. I spend most of the time on it. Certainly as far as respect for science, understanding science, knowing scientists. In the Dissident, one of the characters is well, quite a few characters are scientists. You can't really even get to dissent without scientists. I mean, think of Sakharov. Think of really the beginning of Soviet dissent really begins with physicists. You know, generally you're in trouble when physicists rebel. So in this case, we may have lots of other life scientists rebelling too. So it does affect it, because I mean there is a kind of truth and it's and survival, and to get there you go through science, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But I don't know. These might be just words. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, let's just put what's on the front page every day, and that's the pandemic. Your involvement, you're talking to scientists all the time. What is their sense of what's going on in our country, and how does it affect your ability to gather information?
Oh, our ability to gather information is just fine, thank you. We just call people and get what we need, or email people and get what we need. We've been kind of unaffected. The part that was affected very much was our news coverage, because we basically spent between March and June, the cancer letter was open access, because all we wrote about was COVID. Because all of our subscribers, which is not all of them, but many of our subscribers, ended up not being able to treat any patients, because, and right now, so we wrote about COVID quite a bit. And that's also there's a very interesting thing happening, and I don't know if it's actually happening, but it's being brought into focus, and it's certainly worth talking about, is that some of the cancer drugs, or drugs we know through cancer, are also being put to use here. And some of the things that have been learned through cancer are definitely being put to use, like monoclonal antibodies, for example. Or so immunology, infectious disease, and oncology are still sort of very much separate, and yet you can see a way in which they will at some point merge, whether it will take a generation or a couple of decades, who knows. But some of the same drugs may actually be used. Look at IL-6 antagonists that they're used in immunology, in rheumatology and infectious disease, and were also used in COVID treatment to manage cytokine storm, which is release of cytokines into the lungs. So a lot of that is really happening now. And it's pointing to where the science is heading, unquestionably. So I don't know if that has anything to do with fiction.
All right, going back to your wearing your other hat, the fiction hat, can you talk, David asks, can Paul talk about Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman and what influence it had on him in his writing?
Oh, I love that book. It's like probably The Master and Margarita would be my first most beloved book. And Life and Fate is just exquisite. It's the character, the narrative is amazing. The novelist himself, I mean, Grossman is an amazing writer. I haven't read everything Grossman wrote, but certainly that book. It took me a long time, because it's like, one thing about it is that it came out of, it was smuggled out of the country and published. I have not read it. I didn't read it until quite a bit later. It became a huge worldwide seller in translation, and I never read it in translation. So maybe about 15, 20 years ago, I sat down and finally just opened it, and I couldn't put it down. It's just, it's kind of what it does. It takes the Battle of Stalingrad, and which Grossman was a part of, and uses it in the same way that Tolstoy uses the Battle of Birds and Noah and in War and Peace. And then he tells the stories, in fact, by the way of science, in that case, physics. And he uses urban legends, and he uses his own experience, and he uses, I mean, here's a guy who, please stop me when you've had enough. Here's a guy who has some serious problems in the beginning of the war. First of all, his wife can't stand his mother. His mother is right in the path of the German invasion. His wife says, no, she's not moving in with us in Moscow, no thank you. His mother, who's a physician, by the way, dies in the Holocaust. That totally just makes him, it's like an invasion times whatever. Then he is at that time out of shape, a total mess. He tries to enlist as a private. This is really a true story of Vasily Grossman. And they say to him, you gotta be kidding. You know, here's this guy with a cane. And then he goes to, I believe, the Red Star newspaper, and they take him on as a war correspondent, put him in a car, and he goes towards the Panzers in this car. And then later he becomes like totally an athlete and climbs trees with the snipers behind enemy lines and writes about it. All of this is in that book. I mean, he understands that. He understands the Battle of Stalingrad better than you can possibly imagine. And there's also this anti-Semitism that's starting, all of this that's kind of like brewing the beginning of post-war anti-Semitism. So really, if you look at this kind of a seminal moment in World War II, that is the Battle of Stalingrad. That's the turning point. And he is there. He is there.
Well, I think a lot of people are adjusting their book lists and putting
oh God, yeah,
life and fate on it, as I am.
Yeah.
How do titles, Michelle Sender asks, how do titles affect the sale of books, such as yours, The Yid?
Oh, that was Susan's title. So Susan, would you care to answer that question?
Well, yeah, I think Paul had an earlier draft of that book, and it had a lovely literary title, but it wasn't getting picked up by publishers. And then when I looked at it and said, this is a great book, why don't you call the Yid comes up in the book, and it's clearly a very provocative title. It's at least going to get the attention of editors. And in fact, it did.
Yeah, and the prior title was just to answer the question more fully, was Levinson's Sword. And basically that comes out of a very bad novel, which I love, by the way, called, I don't know if I'm translating it properly, The Defeat, which is the defeat of Red partisans in the Far East by the white forces and Americans and others. So it's kind of but the opening goes something like that. His curved Japanese sword dangling again on the steps, Levinson comes down into the courtyard, and Levinson is this red commander, and in the Yid, the commander, the principal character's name is Levinson. It's a different Levinson, but they're similar. So the idea of Levinson and his sword, to me, was really important, because here I was, a Jewish kid in Moscow, where Jewish contributions were to the revolution, for example, were basically silenced. And here's this book. And by the way, it's a book I would never recommend anyone to read, but I love it.
Well, I've read it and I recommend it.
Yeah.
You navigate not only between science and government, fiction and nonfiction, but you came here as a Russian speaker. I don't know where you started to learn your English, but how do you keep up with your Russian?
I've got a weird history here because most people who come to America at my age, which is 14, their Russian kind of goes down a bit. Mine improved weirdly because I started in college. I drank well, it's important to drink vodka. For Russian, that's like crucial. It's like vitamins. I was drinking vodka with my friend Michael Alexeyev at Duke, and who was a grad student. And he introduced me to his mother, who she and I had this incredible collaboration. She was one of the founders of the Moscow Helsinki Watch Group. She's really the reason that I wrote my first 2 books when I was in my 20s. And she's also the reason I'm able to write this current novel. And in fact, I'm dedicating it to her memory. She's a very major figure, Ludmila Alexeyeva. So Luda basically, I had to, when we were working together in Russian, and she said, well, have you read Tolstoy? No. Have you read, not all of it. Have you read Chekhov? No, not all of it. So she basically would just tell me, just go and, get this. And I would go to this place called Kamkin's bookstore in Rockville, which was full of various spooks and so forth.
Oh, can you keep your voice up a little bit?
Yeah, so I would go to this store called Kamkin's in Rockville and get boxes full of complete works of Russian classics. So I read a lot, and I still do. I don't in Russian. I'm weirdly really out of touch with anything but dead Russians. So my Russian actually improved, and it's very strange. I have very little accent in Russian, and some accent in English.
You also talk to your father.
I also talk to my father, but that's just loud. It doesn't improve your Russian.
Okay, Leslie Sewell asks, is it more difficult to write fiction or nonfiction?
That's just different. It's just different. With it, you see a difference in the sort of the smallest level, and you see the difference on the sort of the largest level. The way a character moves through a fiction narrative is going to be different because the movement can be very different and the outcomes can be very, very different. Like with historical fiction, actually, what's interesting is a book that I just really love is The Plot Against America, Philip Roth. And he got himself painted into a corner because Lindbergh was not. How does history rejoin itself? How does real history happen? So you have that problem sometimes. And by the way, it was resolved in a miniseries, which people should, if anybody hasn't seen or read it, both are worthwhile, especially now. But with fiction, you kind of have to maybe think about what actually happened at one point, and you have to have a sense of where you're going with it and where you're going to end up and have a kind of a battle plan. But with nonfiction, I remember being really concerned about the book that my friend Ludmila Alexeyeva and I were writing. And I said, well, how does it end? And she says, we know how it ended. Because you kind of you can't make up as much. So as far as ease, some things are easier, some things are harder. It's just a very different process, which I think when I was much younger, roughly, maybe 30 years younger, I would have thought they were more similar than they are, but it's to me right now they're becoming more and more difficult as different rather. So it's just a different walk and a different objective. And with historical fiction, the main question to me is, how did people live? It's a subject that, you know, you can't answer sometimes through documentary fiction. What was it like to be there?
Barbara asks if you can talk about Sharansky. She says he was so heroic while in the former Soviet Union, but when he arrived in Israel, he quickly became observant and religious. She asks, is that the influence of his wife? And right-wing politically, was that predictable?
Ooh, oh boy. You've just basically hit on the dissident. You've just basically described my current novel. There's a lot to it, parts of which I understand very well, parts of which I don't understand at all, parts of which I will never believe. So Sharansky is the beginning. To me, the most interesting thing about Sharansky's story was I don't know why it struck me as a novelist, even as I was writing this in my first book, which was a nonfiction book, was his wedding, because it was a Jewish wedding in Moscow, and it was absolutely impossible to have a Jewish wedding in Moscow. I've spoken to many guests because, I mean, how would you do it? I mean, the rabbi was a pig, total chazer. Rabbi Fishman, who was Orthodox and probably a KGB agent. So, you know, he would call in the militia to beat up the refuseniks who were meeting in front of the temple and making a lot of noise. And that was the scene that I saw that kind of was really important for my Jewish identity, for example. But Sharansky sort of shows up as this character who starts, connects with the dissident movement. Which is non-secular. So now comes a question, and this was again really a live wire question of what do you do? Is the Jewish question, as Israelis wanted them to be, separate from the human rights questions? Because Jewish questions could be really addressed, like throw them the heck out, right? The human rights questions, that includes Crimean Tatars, that includes the rights of Russian Orthodox believers, that includes Pentecostalists, whatever. And all of that was happening. So Sharansky kind of comes into this and by the way, he was warned, totally warned by the group of, somebody from a group of Soviet Jews known as the Red Guard, like Chinese Red Guard, because they were so gung-ho Zionist, to not be there with Sakharov, for example. So by the time Sharansky gets arrested, and I'm skipping some, really, actually, I'm not going to skip this. This is a really important point. There's a question of what the CIA does in all of this. It's a very important question. For years prior to that time, to Sharansky time, CIA would not take walk-ins who had any public connections, okay? Then at one point, through an embassy connection and through another activist named Vitaly Rubin, and I'm basing this on his diary, which I came across 35 years ago. His wife gave it to me. You know, it became possible to infiltrate the Jewish movement and the dissident movement, primarily the Jewish movement, with a double agent. And that was the guy who accused later Sharansky of the various things. Did Sharansky know? I mean, this guy received CIA instructions on what to do. He was basically peddling stealth technology. to Americans. And of course, he had no stealth technology. He just wanted to get instructions, and he got the instructions. That blew up in Sharansky's face. Did Sharansky know about his friend being a double agent? I have no idea. Probably, I hope not. I would, it's such a hot story. It's still a live wire story that a few years ago, someone wrote a nonfiction book kind of called Sharansky Unmasked in Israel. I've read the Russian version of it. It was banned by Israelis. Can you imagine banning a book in Israel, what it would take? And this guy was actually also lost a civil lawsuit and had to pay Sharansky or somebody some money for it. It's a crappy book. I can't endorse that. Don't put it on your list, because half of it I know to be just not true, but some parts of it are fascinating. But the idea that the story still continues to be like that. And by the way, so when he goes into prison, Sharansky is a human rights activist whom we all love and we all hope. And then he shows up in Israel, and again, his wife and so forth, and he turns into a more of a right-wing politician, probably secular. I would have to say secular. His wife is not. I think he is very much so. In fact, to the point where he was traveling with a friend of mine through the US, and somebody asked him, very, very pious Jew, asked Sharansky to bless him. So he says, "How do I bless you?" And he says, "Well, just do it." So he puts his hand on this guy's bald spot and says, "Hamotzi." So, which may have been appropriate in that case. So maybe
I'm afraid we've gone over, and I think that's a tribute to the fascination we have with all your stories. So I would like to thank you for coming today and sharing your vast knowledge. I'm going to look for the book, and I'm going to ask Susan, have you got something coming out we should be looking for?
Not yet, but in the works.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you for asking.
Thank you both. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul and Susan, for an excellent presentation. And thank you, Sid, for your continuing great job as moderator. Paul and Susan, it's been a delight to delve into the world of fiction and nonfiction writing with you. With everything that's going on in our world today, it was a welcome break. But I have to say, we always talk about Trump no matter what. And,
Oh, yeah.
And Paul, I have been at Sunny Isles, Florida. So I know full well the juxtaposition between the large Russian population there, and then there are 2 Trump condos right there.
One of them is called the Chateau, by the way.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Thank you. All right. So for those of us who haven't done so, and I count myself, I know that reading your books will bring a lot of smiles and laughter into our lives. One reviewer wrote that Paul's second novel, The Chateau, published in 2018, is a salty, witty, tragic comedy that mocks Russian Jewish immigrants, Florida retirees, condo living. I love the term Donald Tramp, as the Russians call him. It's filled with gags, slapstick, and snappy repartee, and is a satire which provides sharp commentary on American society. This sounds like a book for lifting our spirits and nourishing our mental health. Susan's 5 novels should also be in our list of books. And by the way, thank you, Paul, for all those recommendations. Susan's most recent book, The Stager, has been described as great fun in a New York Times book review. And the reviewer goes on to write that Coll proves herself as shrewd, a social anthropologist, as she is a buoyant writer. How lucky for us that we had the pleasure of having husband and wife authors here today. Though we remain muted, I know that the more than 60 or so people who are here now with us will join me in a rousing round of applause to thank you both.
Well, thank you. It was
Thank
fun.
Before we move into our breakout rooms, I want to let everyone know that the next Lunch and Learn program will be held on November 11th. The speaker will be Dr. Andrew S. Narva, and his topic will be Changing the Course of Diabetes in Indian Country. For more than 2 decades, Andy was a physician in the Indian Health Service. The National Kidney Foundation honored him as the recipient of the 2018 Public Service Award for his work with Indigenous Peoples of America. It's fitting that Andy will be speaking next month, as November was designated by an act of Congress in the 1990s at what is now known as National American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month. In a few minutes, David Diskin, our very able Zoom master, will place each of us randomly at various breakout tables. We will spend about 20 minutes here and then we'll come together for a brief closing. To start off your discussions today, we have 2 questions from Paul and Susan as follows, and you can find them in the chat room. What does a historical novel do that a work of history cannot? Can you think of any eras that you understand primarily through fiction? And secondly, were you involved in the Soviet Jewry movement? What are your memories of that moment? What do you know now that you didn't know then? Most importantly, of course, you will have a chance to see and chat with old and new friends. Be sure to introduce yourself if you don't know all the people in your breakout room. You may now unmute your audio, turn on your video. Be sure you're in the gallery view